Coming up on Capital Crossfire, the war in Ukraine rages with mass devastation throughout the country. A historic Supreme Court nomination is underway, and the 2022 midterm season is here. Joining us from the left, Yvonne Liccione, and from the right, Greg Shumakevich. And I'm your moderator, Jessica Nix. From the GWTV studios here in Washington, D.C., this is Capital Crossfire. Russia's invasion of Ukraine started a month ago. Since then, countries have placed sanctions on Russia. Many companies, including social media companies like Facebook and Instagram, have suspended services to the country. The United States has poured millions of dollars of weapons and aid into Ukraine. Our panel is here to discuss that and more. On the left, Yvonne Liccione, a sophomore majoring in political communication. Yvonne is from Waxhaw, North Carolina, and is the social media manager for SMPA here at GW. She is also a communications intern with Meta Advisors. On the right, Greg Shumakevich, a junior majoring in international affairs and political science. Greg is from Dallas, Texas, and a member of the GW College Republicans. I love the Southern representation, so thank you both for joining me here today. We're going to get started with Russia and Ukraine. A month into Russia's invasion, and the world has watched as millions of people flee the country from the fighting. Countries are hitting Russia with sanctions, but there are no signs of peace. The Ukrainian people are fighting back, with many reports pointing to a struggling Russian army. Adding a layer, the U.S. and NATO countries are not getting involved directly because Ukraine is not a NATO member. Ukraine is calling for a no-fly zone in the country, but Biden and NATO allies are saying this would ignite conflict between Russia and NATO, essentially starting World War III. So, Greg, I'm going to go to you first for this first question. Would this be the start of World War III, and how do NATO countries avoid mass conflict while still protecting Ukraine's skies?
A no-fly zone enforced by the United States would unquestionably mean the start of World War III. Let's be honest, Vladimir Putin has shown no moderation. He's clearly willing to kill huge amounts of people. If American fighter jets are shooting down Russian fighter jets over Ukraine, he will attack NATO. It will be World War III. We cannot do it.
Yvonne, Ukraine is calling for a no-fly zone to protect their cities. If this leads to a larger conflict, how does NATO weigh if it's worth it to create the no-fly zone after seeing so much destruction?
I think NATO needs to weigh what the escalation risk is. Now, Putin clearly has the advantage here, and a lot of Ukrainian refugees are fleeing into Baltic states. If Putin continues this invasion of Ukraine and ultimately pushes towards their western border, I think NATO could weigh that it might be useful to create a no-fly zone, but I also think we should be as limited as possible with that. I agree. We don't want to start World War III. We do not want a hot war with Russia, and the U.S. is clearly more intent on avoiding that than Russia is.
I agree. NATO was created to prevent war in Europe. If NATO takes the proactive decision to take military action in Ukraine, I think not only would that be a clear violation of its mission, but it'd also be reckless, and it would only hurt the Ukrainian people even more.
So I do want to add another layer to this. The United States has warned of Russia turning to chemical weapons now that what Putin thought would be a quick invasion of Ukraine is really dragging on. President Joe Biden has warned of Putin not only employing chemical weapons, but also mass cyber attacks as the next move. So, Yvonne, what global implications could the use of chemical weapons have in Ukraine? And will Biden be forced to draw a red line like Obama had to with Syria?
Yeah, I do think, first of all, the environmental impact and the long-term effects of chemical weapons are horrific and need to be avoided. Second of all, we've already been calling Putin a war criminal. Many NATO nations have already moved to say that Putin is committing war crimes, and this would once again undoubtedly be a war crime. Now, I think the concern here is that regardless, Putin has the escalation advantage here, and he can use chemical weapons and still make Ukraine's life a lot harder. I don't know if Biden has a good out here. I don't know if he can honestly say if Putin uses chemical weapons, that's when we escalate. Because again, there's just so much at stake here.
So Greg, if Putin uses chemical weapons next, should we expect the U.S. to take more direct action rather than sending money like we have been?
Well, let's be frank. I'm not putting using chemical weapons past Putin. He could do it, but just like with Obama's red line in the sand in Syria, a Biden red line in the grass of Ukraine would be meaningless because the United States clearly does not have the resolve necessary to escalate this into a war. How would you tell working class Americans to send their sons and daughters to die in Ukraine. What American interest exists in Ukraine? There is none. So a red line in Ukraine would be totally unenforceable. It would just be another display of American weakness. We've seen a lot of that with Joe Biden already.
So a huge concern from this war are the human rights abuses. Recently, a theater housing children was bombed. We've seen reports of hospitals bombed and citizens being forced out of the city of Mariupol. There is a massive refugee crisis with millions displaced and fleeing the country, and we're seeing an uptick of COVID cases in the area. So Greg, I'm going to go to you first. If a no-fly zone is out of the question, how does NATO and the U.S. respond to these abuses and public health concerns? More sanctions and aid, because over 24 Senate Republicans voted against a bill for extra aid and then said they wanted to send more aid to Ukraine.
This is a really good question. So I think that America's primary objective in Ukraine should be ending the war as soon as possible. I think it's pretty much generally agreed upon that America is not going to put boots on the ground in Ukraine. The Russian military will defeat the Ukrainian military. Whether it takes another month, whether it takes another year, they will defeat the Ukrainian military. So how do we make it not a year, but a month, or hopefully end the war as soon as possible? And the answer is, unfortunately, we have to tell President Zelensky, go to the table with Putin, agree to his concessions. What is the Russian objective in Ukraine? The end of any hope for NATO membership for Ukraine forever. We can agree to that. And the concession of Crimea and of the Donbass to Russia. Now, of course, this is a violation of sovereignty. Of course, what Putin has done is a crime. But to stop the war, these are the terms that must be agreed upon. And if I just may add, if we actually impel Volodymyr Zelensky to go to the negotiating table with Vladimir Putin, then we can actually start to turn Russia into more of an American ally against the Chinese. My main focus as an American is the geopolitical conflict with China. And if we can turn Russia away from the Chinese and towards the Americans and stop the war in Ukraine at the same time, that's what we should do.
So Yvonne, what's the response from NATO and the U.S. to these human rights abuses? And if Republicans are voting against aid in the Senate and publicly claiming that they do support aid, how do Democrats appeal to Republicans to get them on board for more aid?
At a certain point, I do think we're at a place with polarization in this country where if one side says the sky is blue, the other one's going to say it's green. Yep. So I don't quite know that you can, and calling people hypocrites anymore doesn't work. You can't say, well, oh, you support Ukrainian aid, but you don't actually vote that way. The American people ultimately aren't going to care about that. So I think what Democrats need to do is make it clear to Republicans that although sure, I think we need to agree on a few things. I think ending the war in Ukraine should be our first priority. I might disagree with what the concession should be, but ultimately it's what needs to be done. And then send as much humanitarian aid. We need shelter, we need medical professionals, we need help for the people, and military power, while important, can't be our only focus here.
Yes.
So Biden also recently called President Putin a war criminal. So we're going to listen to that really quick.
Oh, I think he is a war criminal.
Will you be meeting with him?
Yvonne, this is the harshest comment on Putin's actions from the White House. The comment is a shift after Ukrainian President Zelensky spoke to Congress in an impassioned plea and showed a video of Ukrainians suffering to Congress. The State Department and the White House officials are continuing to call for investigating acts of war crimes. So now that the U.S. president is calling Putin a war criminal, will we see faster action from the International Criminal Court and more world leaders calling him a war criminal?
I think it's entirely possible that we might see more world leaders calling him a war criminal. However, I don't know if that term has a lot of meaning anymore. I've seen 1,000,001 things calling every American president a war criminal. I don't really think it's a term that, to the populace means anything. Sure, it might mean things in international court, but ultimately, how useful is that? I would hope that things move faster. I'm not convinced.
I completely agree. I don't think that, the harsh rhetoric coming from Biden is exactly productive. Of course, he is a war criminal. He is killing civilians, but he's not going to be arrested anytime soon. So I think it's a little bit better to use more diplomatic language instead of just, making him angry and angrier by using this sort of inflamed rhetoric.
Yeah, I wouldn't quite say that. Like, I don't know if I care how diplomatic Biden's language is. Ultimately, I'm just thinking about what is going to play with Americans and what's going to play with Russians. Now, we don't know what's playing with Russians. We have no idea what's going on with them anymore, which I think is a huge disadvantage to us.
Yes.
And also, sure, Americans don't like Putin. They're going to go, great, he's a war criminal, and move on with their days.
Yeah.
Ukraine's fading into the background.
No.
This isn't important anymore.
I think about the actual concerns facing Americans. Inflation is running rampant. Drug ODs are running rampant. The working class is losing wages. They don't care about Ukraine. Let's just be honest.
It's unique that we've had such focus on an international issue, and
Yeah.
I do think we should care about international issues. However, that's not where Americans are.
And this is a tangent, but I won't get into it. But I do think that a lot of the focus on Ukraine is coming from a media establishment that's trying to protect the candidate they so obviously supported in the election and so obviously support today.
I'm pushing back against that, actually, because media is going to talk a lot about what the president does, and the media has been both critical and very supportive of Biden. Different outlets are going to say what they will. We expect these things. However, I don't know how the situation would have played if Trump would have won presidency. I actually think he might have been. I believe Putin would have been met with less resistance than he has been currently. However, Trump and Putin had a adversarial at times relationship, but also a friendly enough relationship. So I don't quite know how this would have gone, and I know that Trump had issues with Zelensky.
So I do want to push at a little bit about what you guys are talking about with Americans caring, basically, about what's going on. Of course, there are some kitchen table issues like inflation that's happening right now, but the midterms are also coming up, and Biden seems to be weighing his actions politically. We saw a chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan, but U.S. involvement in Ukraine is becoming more and more popular in the polls. So, Greg, is Biden in a public opinion stalemate, and could direct involvement help his public approval? You were talking about that a little bit, but approval is rising for Biden since his State of the Union, but could Ukraine help the Democrats in November?
I think I'll take a slightly unpopular opinion here and say that it probably won't help them. So you're right, approval is rising. It ticks up from like 39% to 41%. So congratulations, Biden, right? But I think that Americans are wise to entangling foreign conflicts. We saw the disaster in Iraq. We obviously saw the disaster in Afghanistan under Joe Biden. So I think that while Americans do care about the Ukrainian people, Americans are the best people on earth. We care when people are suffering. I don't think you will find broad popular support for military involvement in Ukraine. Now, on the political aspect of it, 100% Joe Biden is using this as a political cudgel. I mean, look at his domestic agenda. It's completely failing. He's passed, I think, one of his 5 major pieces of legislation. Inflation is running rampant, as I have said. He's incredibly unpopular. He's handled COVID poorly. More people have died from COVID under Joe Biden than under Donald Trump. So yeah, he's jumped on this, very cynically, I might add, because he thinks it will save him in the midterms. And I have too much faith in the American people to say that they're going to be distracted by this obvious political ploy from Joe Biden. I think they realize that Democrat leadership is failing this country, and I think they're going to vote accordingly.
Yvonne, what's your political response to that?
I think Democrats are in an incredibly difficult position. We have no idea how to manage Manchin in Sinema, and we did not expect to be dealing with these 2 little gremlins in Senate. Now, obviously, Joe Biden, like any other American president, is using a crisis to his advantage.
Of course.
That's what he's doing in Ukraine. And no, I don't think that it will actually help in the midterms, because people's political memory just isn't that long, and we're not going to be super concerned about what's happening in Ukraine in November unless it actually has domestic effects here. Now, I wouldn't say the Democrat leadership is failing this country. Joe Biden has failed to pass his major legislation, and I agree he needs a win. He doesn't want a bad track record militarily in his first term in office. However, there have been many presidents who had a really rough first couple of years. Richard Nixon comes to mind with their first term in office, because they're handling a difficult country. We are coming out of a pandemic. We don't quite know that it's still changing, it's still evolving, we're still learning. We are handling a very diverse country and trying to reckon with our history and also teach that history in an appropriate way. And everything is being turned into a media battle. So yeah, we're being handed kind of a nightmare. both parties, and unfortunately no one's just working together.
So I am going to have to wrap up. I'm going to have to make that the last word for timing. So that's going to wrap us up on our discussion of the Ukraine-Russian war. And when we come back, a historic Supreme Court nominee starts her nomination hearings. Stay with us.
Universities like George Washington play a critical role in hosting debate and discourse on events of the day.
The right answer is not to refuse the other. The right answer is not to say, get rid of this religion. It's not part of us. It's wrong.
I think that the story of America is the story of race. So when I think of the questions that I'm asking or the stories that I'm going to write, I'm thinking, okay, well, what are we learning about our country?
Well, I think the likelihood of him being indicted is close to 100%. There was a lot of hurdles that had to be cleared in order for that to happen.
One of the reasons that Donald Trump is president is because there is such a frustration with the way that Washington functions.
Sympathy is one thing, but empathy is the language of recovery, and it's something that's without a doubt instilled into every person that's in recovery.
It's never lead with the positive, it's always lead with the perceived negative.
Well, that is part of the problem. I mean, I actually would agree with you on that.
Thank you.
You're welcome. One of the things that we have seen that is most under siege in this country is the notion of civil discourse, and we here at GW, among other things, very much want to stand for that.
This is truly an only at GW moment.
Welcome back. Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson is taking the stand in front of the Senate Judiciary Committee. If confirmed by the Senate, Brown Jackson would be the first black woman to take the bench on the Supreme Court. She has visited 45 senators ahead of her hearings, and if the Senate Judiciary Committee advances her nomination to the full Senate, we would most likely see her confirmation in a democratically held Senate. Republicans are fighting against her nomination, including attacking her previous experience of being a public defender, and this is where we're going to start our debate. Yvonne, I'm going to go to you first. Is Jackson's history as a public defender the root cause of the GOP attack and labeling her as soft on crime? And would the attacks be the same if she was a federal prosecutor?
No, I don't think her background as a public defender is the problem. I think the problem is that she is a blue SCOTUS nomination, ultimately. She's not soft on crime. Republicans have been calling Democrats soft on crime since the term tough on crime came into existence, and this is the same party where current president helped pen the 1992 crime bill. Democrats historically have never been soft on crime. This is just a really effective attack, personally.
Well, I'm going to push back on that a little bit. I do think that Judge Jackson is soft on crime. Just look at her sentencing from the bench, from the federal bench. There's this whole issue of child porn that came up during the hearings, and the fact of the matter is she did slash a sentence by 3, a recommended sentence of 92 months. She said at 24 months. That seems to be pretty soft on a convicted child sex offender.
But there's a difference between being soft on crime and not overly punitive. Brown Jackson didn't pass down any other rulings that were not common by other justices, and the sentencing guidelines are set by Congress. Part of the new sentencing guidelines were part of a 1984 overhaul. This isn't new, it's just what she has to do. She's politically constrained, and she handed down a sentence.
Well, at the time, she did hand out a sentence that was significantally lower than the guidelines.
Okay, but a couple more months in jail doesn't stop him from being a child sex trafficker.
But it at least keeps him in jail, right?
People have to leave jail and then re-enter society eventually. Sure, if you don't give them any tools to re-enter society, they're going to keep committing crimes. You can't just treat criminals like they're different and other and not quite people.
Well, I would say that, for a shoplifter or for someone who committed a minor drug offense, of course that's true. And I think that for minor crimes like that, there shouldn't be these punitive sentencing guidelines. But this was a serious crime. And by the way, it's not the only one. Routinely, Judge Jackson sentenced lower than the guidelines for violent criminals, for criminals who are repeat offenders, and for child sex offenders. I mean, she does have a track record of being overly lenient, and maybe that's her judicial philosophy, but frankly, I don't think it's exactly what we need for the Supreme Court of the United States.
She's incredibly qualified, and again, she's not overly lenient. We're dealing with a judicial system in this country that for generations has been overly punitive and thinks that incarceration is the solution. This country admits that rehabilitation and deterrence are no longer and point of our prison system. So what is the point of the prison system? You take all the dangerous people and then you lock them away. You don't expect people to commit less crimes. You don't give them support so they have to commit less crimes. And you don't try to rehabilitate those people either in prison or out of it.
Okay,
so,
I'm going to jump in really quick and I'm going to bring us back into the hearing process and bring in a couple senators and some of their reactions. So one senator who was fairly silent on her nomination is Senator Lindsey Graham from South Carolina. Graham voted for Brown Jackson when she was nominated for the D.C. Court of Appeals. However, on the first day of questioning, Graham focused on Brown Jackson's religious views and continuously referred to the questioning of Justice Amy Coney Barrett's religion during her questioning. Senator Joe Manchin from West Virginia is a Democratic senator who has dominated headlines this past year as a senator more likely to toe the party line. As a moderate senator who reaches into the Republican Party more frequently, he described his meeting with Brown Jackson as positive. So, Greg, I'm going to give you this first question. Is Senator Joe Manchin's stance a signal that Democrats are confident in her nomination, even with Graham's tactics that are appealing to members of his own party to maybe change their vote?
Oh, I think she's going to get 100% confirmed. Like, sure, I don't like her. Sure, 35 Republican senators don't like her. But she's going to be confirmed by the Senate. Of that, I have no doubt. Do I wish that she was? No. But, Republicans are pushovers. They're a weak party. They're not going to fight back on a nominee like Judge Jackson. I think that she'll get confirmed with 60 votes, maybe even something like 65.
So, Yvonne, are Democrats confident, even with these GOP tactics of bringing up recent controversial Supreme Court hearings?
I don't think the GOP tactics are anything new. SCOTUS hearings in this country have been a dog and pony show for as long as I have been watching them. They are, a lot of what I've been seeing is Republican senators trying to relitigate Brett Kavanaugh and relitigate Amy Coney Barrett. Yep. And they're on the Supreme Court, so it doesn't really matter. Yep. I do agree. Of course, Democrats eventually are going to coalesce around Brown Jackson. Ultimately, Sinema and Manchin might have their little 5 seconds of fame, but you're not going to give up a SCOTUS nomination. I agree that we're confident, but everything I've been seeing out of these hearings is just a circus.
And keep in mind that what Yvonne just said is correct. This is a political show. This isn't an actual hearing for a Supreme Court nominee. No one's figuring out new information here. Senators are trying to get 5-second clips that they can post on Twitter. That's what's going on right now. And I think it's actually a tragedy because the political situation in this country is very polarized, as you say. And it would be nice if we had, two political parties that actually had substantive positions, that actually were willing to fight for their voters, and not just coalesce into a uniparty on every single question that matters. Absolutely.
I think the question's, designed to evoke ideas that the Republicans are being fairer to Brown Jackson than Democrats were to Kavanaugh or Coney Barrett, again, are ridiculous. The concern with Coney Barrett, for me personally, was that she's never spent a day in a courtroom in her life. Not that she has a religion where sometimes women get called handmaidens. Lindsey Graham asking Brown Jackson how many times she goes to church doesn't really affect her judicial philosophy.
I completely agree. And don't get me wrong, what the Democrats did to Amy Coney Barrett and Brett Kavanaugh is disgusting. I think it was a national travesty. But that doesn't allow the Republican Party to ask similar questions to Judge Jackson. I do think that what Senator Graham did was largely unproductive. And another reason that I think Senator Graham is not very representative of the people who actually vote for him.
Well, I'm glad we are able to find a little bit of consensus, but that will be the last word on the Supreme Court hearings. Up next, Rapid Fire. We'll be right back.
Hi, Colonials. Did you know there are hundreds of ways for you to volunteer with GW? Each year, over 1,500 alumni, parents, and friends contribute thousands of hours to make our community stronger. There are countless ways you can volunteer, so it's easy to choose an opportunity that is most meaningful to you, like connecting with students and alumni based on your student involvement, identity, or personal interests, getting involved with your local alumni network, mentoring a current student via our online mentoring platform, connecting with prospective students through undergraduate admissions opportunities, serving on an industry network leadership council, becoming a social media ambassador. The list goes on. No matter where you are in the world or how much time you have to give, you can connect and volunteer with GW. And the best part? It's easy to get involved. Just visit alumni.gwu.edu/volunteer to learn more about these and other opportunities. Because of your service to GW, you are able to make a direct impact on the lives of former, current, and future students. We look forward to working with you. Raise high.
Welcome back to Rapid Fire. Some quick answers to some quick questions. Up first, movement or lack thereof from the Hill. With news media focusing on the war abroad and the Supreme Court hearings, a lot of news and policy proposals have been swept under the rug. Biden's first State of the Union proposed some bigger policy goals, including some aimed at the economy. Inflation is still at record rates and gas prices are even higher since his address. Focus on the child tax credit has dwindled, and policy talks about lawmakers buying stocks has diminished. COVID aid is also in danger, with even Democrats voting against a recent bill in the House. Headed into the midterm elections, with a lot of Democrats want to accomplish on the docket beforehand, how can Congress walk and chew gum at the same time? So, Yvonne, I'm going to give you the first question. Are lawmakers getting pulled into too many directions to get anything else done headed into the summer? Biden has a big agenda, but how can they capitalize on legislation before November?
I don't think that they're being pulled in too many different directions. I think that there are too many needless voices shouting. I think what needs to happen is the Democrats need to whip their votes and make sure that the party falls in line. Democrats are terrible at doing it. We need to learn how to do it.
I think that what's going on right now is that the Democrats are purposefully trying to obfuscate the issues they failed on. We get an angry Putin, we get a transgender admiral, we get a historic Supreme Court nominee. We don't get anything done for the American people because the Democrats can't get anything done for the American people. They're the ones who caused inflation. They're not going to fix it. They don't even want to, and I don't even think that they really care. So they're just trying to distract us, and that's what's going on.
So, Greg, I want to push a little bit. So can Congress even find consensus between the parties right now? Because it seems like there could be a possibility of bipartisanship with a member of your party, Senator Chuck Grassley. He recently introduced legislation on lowering drug prices, which was one of Biden's main goals in his State of the Union.
I would love if that happened. I would just be very surprised. I just don't have faith in Congress, in the president, and frankly in either party to get issues like this solved. I think that what we need in this country to solve issues like drug prices, which are horrible, we pay the highest drug prices in the world and we're the richest country in the world. How does that make sense? But what we need for that is a political reset. We need political evolution from both the Republican and Democrat Party. I don't think we need, establishment rhinos like Chuck Grassley.
Yvonne?
Yeah, so I do agree with Chuck Grassley when he said that he doesn't think that after November, if and when the Democrats lose the Senate, that they'll be able to get any drug policy passed. Now, we know that prescription drug policy, like lowering the prices, is popular. We know it has bipartisan support, and we know it needs to happen. However, I do agree both parties aren't going to put actual pieces into play on that until they can get a media headline. However, I do think that the problem in this country with prescription drugs isn't just that the prices are too high, it's that we are living in a country where drug companies dictate what happens to the American people 100%. And their medicine. We need this to come from healthcare providers, and we need healthcare providers to set the standard.
Yeah, well, if the government wanted to rein in the monopolies, the pharma and the tech monopolies that run this country, I think that would be a great idea.
I agree. I also do think that both monopolies are making it intentionally hard. Tech legislation is a nightmare and not even effective.
Yeah.
So we're going to head on down to the Lone Star State. Texas was our first test case for the midterm elections. The Texas primaries were a month ago, and we saw some Trump-endorsed candidates and popular progressive candidates lose. So, Greg, as our resident Texan, I'm going to give you our first question. Is this a signal that Americans want more moderate candidates on both sides of the aisle? And can we see this trend of moderate candidates prevailing as the primaries continue?
I actually think the opposite. I think that the Texas midterms were a positive step for both progressives and for right-wing populists. Let me just start by saying that as a Texan, my state is hopelessly enamored with establishment Republicans. We're not Florida. We're not going to nominate a DeSantis. We're full of too many rhinos. I'm sorry. But Even still, we saw my hometown representative, Van Taylor, announce that he's not going to seek a second term, and a populist will almost certainly take his place. There has been some populist movement in Texas. Don Huffines and Allen West each got more than 10% in the gubernatorial primary. And everybody knew that Greg Abbott was going to win the gubernatorial primary, but the fact that they even got over 10% is amazing. Also keep in mind, these were the earliest primaries in the country by like 3 months. They happened in March. All the other primaries happen in August. This is a very early primary. Americans aren't super politically engaged in the political process right now. They're not really worrying about the midterms right now as much. And even still, we saw some positive steps for populism and for progressivism in Dallas and Houston. So I think that you know, the trend of Americans becoming more and more disenchanted with the establishments of both parties and turning towards populism, which is I hope what they turn towards, or progressivism, which I don't want them to turn towards. But I think that trend is accelerating even still with these Texas primaries.
I do agree that that is what the American people seem to want. There has been broad support for populist policies. However, I do think that what's happening in Texas as a horrifically gerrymandered state, coming from a horrifically gerrymandered state myself, is that we're setting up conditions where it makes it easier and easier for extremists to win on both sides. If you have a deep red district or a deep blue district, you can have an AOC or a Marjorie Taylor Greene win.
Yeah, you can.
Yeah, and that's truly what we need to redistrict Texas, because if not, we're not going to see more moderates.
And that's going to wrap up our second Capital Crossfire debate of the semester. Yvonne, Liccione, and Greg Shumakevich, thank you both for coming on this lively debate and coming on the show. When we come back, Emmanuel Dyer-Malhaldo will have your fact check.
Raise high. This isn't just our battle cry, it's our call, our challenge. Because when you were called to Washington, you were called to higher expectations, to a higher standard. We are called here to advance knowledge, to serve society, to change the world. Is that too lofty? Too aspirational? Is it simply too much to expect? Not if your classroom is a Smithsonian, the IMF, or on the doorstep of the Supreme Court. Not if you have access to the most hallowed institutions and formidable leaders. Not if you are given the tools to change minds, shape laws, influence entire fields of study, advance our way of life, change the course of history. From the nation's capital to the four corners of the earth, to far below the surface and far beyond our atmosphere, here, unique opportunities, the ones that many people work much of their lives to get, are within your reach from the moment you arrive. This is where you find new pathways for preventing global epidemics, where your unexpected friend propels a new scientific movement forward. This is where you push forward as a team to break records and reach new heights. Where your classroom is 68 square miles of the most consequential land on Earth. This is where you will make it happen. This is the George Washington University, and what we make is history. So stand up, be bold, take risks, press on, push harder, raise high.
During our panel discussion, a team of fact-checkers monitored our debate. Emmanuel Dyer-Malhaldo is here to fill us in on what we missed. Emmanuel?
Thank you, Jessica. Our debaters came prepared for today's debate with few errors. However, some clarifications need to be made. Democrat Yvonne Liccione said Judge Amy Coney Barrett had not spent a day in court before her Supreme Court appointment. This statement is false. During her time as a Seventh Circuit judge, she presided in over 600 cases. Liccione also mentioned that Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson did not differ from national guidelines when sentencing sex offenders. According to The Hill, Jackson gave the defendant a 3-month prison sentence below the government's recommendation of 2 years in prison and far below the federal advisory guideline of a minimum of 8 years of incarceration. Republican Greg Shumakevich claimed that drug overdoses and inflation were both on the rise. To clarify, both hit all-time highs in mid-February and may decrease in the coming months as the Fed changes interest rates and pandemic-era restrictions come to an end. Lastly, Shumakevich claimed that the U.S. public does not support a military intervention in Ukraine. A global survey conducted by Signal showed that military intervention had some support among U.S. respondents, with the poll reporting 39% support. Military supply and financial aid have broader support, with around 2 in 3 Americans supporting both types of aid. Thank you, Jessica.
Well, that is all for this episode of Capital Crossfire. Be sure to check us out online at www.gw-tv.com and like us on Facebook, check us out on Twitter, and check us out on Instagram. For all of us here at GWTV, I'm Jessica Nix. Thanks for getting caught in the crossfire with us. We'll see you next time.